Digitizing Delmarva's Heritage and Traditions. Today, we have with us Bob Miller, longtime county agent for Wicomico County. Now, let's just relax and just have a nice conversation, because your knowledge covers many, many years of agriculture in Wicomico County, I know. But let's start out by telling us, were you born and raised in Wicomico County?
Phil, I grew up in the hills of Garrett County.
Garrett County.
And that's the last county west, near the little town of Accident. My dad had a crop and livestock farm, which I learned all the farm chores. In fact, there was no money then. That was during the Depression. So to earn any money, I had a trap line. And believe it or not, I trapped skunks, possums, weasels, and an occasional mink, which was a high dollar item. But today, I see the only trapping I hear of is maybe a fox or two and muskrat. But back then, farm boys made what money they had by a trap line.
Mm-hmm. So you graduated from high school and went to college, I guess?
We had 11 years of school back then. I went in the Navy. I was drafted. Of course, I was right during World War II. So I was drafted, and I ended up in the Navy and served overseas nearly 2 years, came back, and in 1946, I entered the University of Maryland and graduated in 1950. And then I was lucky enough to it was tough getting a job in 1950. I was lucky enough to get a job in Westminster as a ag teacher.
Oh.
And believe it or not, they didn't pay very well back then, and we were expecting our first child. So I told my wife, Pat, I said, I think we're going to have to make a change. And then I was offered a chance to go in extension service, which gave me a nice raise to start out. At that time, a $600 raise was a big raise.
Huge.
And then I went to Cecil County for 2 years as the extension agent. And when the opportunity opened up in Wicomico, the university asked me if I'd like to move to Wicomico. Well, I didn't know much about Wicomico then. And I thought, well, that's near Ocean City. It shouldn't be too bad. So that's when I started in Wicomico in 1953.
So you, I guess the farm community welcomed you into Wicomico County. What did you find when you got here in 1953? What were most of the farmers doing?
Well, of course, the county was heavily into vegetable crops then, and soybeans and corn were major crops too, but vegetables, that was a prime income for a lot of farmers. But one of the things that stands out in my memory was some of the areas were a little bit standoffish to a stranger. I know when I would go into the little restaurant in Powellville there at the crossroads, if there were some farmers in there, when I first went in, they would sort of just quiet. Nobody would say anything. Well, then Lloyd Jones was one of our 4-H club leaders, and Lloyd and I became good friends, and he took me under his wing. He and Hargis Jones had a blacksmith shop, and Hargis could do anything. And the farmers in that area, when they had a problem, they would go to Hargis, and he would take care of it. Well, Hargis also took me under his wing, and I worked with Hargis on, believe it or not, chemical weed control. When it first came out, Hargis was very interested in chemical weed control. So I had some weed control plots on Hargis's farm, and he thought that was great. And that opened the door to that area.
So if you're okay with Lloyd and Hargis, you were okay with everybody else.
You were okay with everybody else. That's the way it worked. And
yeah.
That became a great area to work in. I loved all the farmers over there, and it was just great.
And I guess somewhat different soil types in, let's say, Powellville than on the west side of Wicomico.
Well, much of the east side has black soils, which they're very fertile when they're drained, and drainage was their big problem, but that came along a little bit later. But the soils on the east side generally are much more productive for grain, for corn and soybeans, than they are on the west side, which is tended more droughty.
Now, how long were you the extension agent?
From 1953 to 1980.
So a good time to be, and you saw a lot of changes. And then after you retired from the extension office, you still stayed in agriculture a little bit, didn't you?
Well, I went to work with Maryland National Bank for 13 years as an ag lender. I enjoyed that very, very much. However, we were dealing in the 80s with interest rates of 16, 17, 18%, which was, I mean, very difficult for any borrower to work with. But that's the way it was then.
Yeah. So let's kind of look at some of your slides, which will give us a really a good view. Some of them comical and but certainly all very interesting. And we want you to identify the people, if you can, who are in the slides.
This slide, this was the workhorse of the vegetable farmers in the 40s and 50s. It was a farm all tractor. And here, this lady is using a two-bottom plow. And that was a step up from the team of mules and a one-bottom walking plow. So that in itself was a big revolution. This farmer, this was Buster Robinson, and he is cultivating, I think at that time, cucumbers. It's hard to see the row, but that was a one-row cultivator. And of course, weed control then was either hoeing or cultivating. So they were very particular to cultivate at the right time.
And just to keep things in perspective, Buster Robinson is now Elder Buster Robinson, who has a church, Mount Enoch Church, out on Rockawalking Ridge Road, right?
Buster has a very good church on Rockawalking Ridge Road, and he still does. He raises chickens and still does some farming. Yes.
And I think is a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
I'm sure he is. This was a farmer cultivating sweet potatoes with a narrow front end tractor. At that time, we had no chemical weed control, so cultivating was an absolute necessity to keep down weeds, and weeds in a soybean field just didn't go together. But this was Archie Humphreys up near Delmarva. That is Cecil Houghton. This was a big movement up with a four-row cultivator. That doubled the time you could cultivate soybeans, and it was a big innovation to come in with a four-row cultivator. So here again, it was something you had to do to keep down weeds.
Now, Cecil Houghton was out toward Mount Herman, right?
Right. The Houghton brothers owned a packing shed on Mount Herman Road, and they grew a lot of watermelons, cantaloupes, and sweet potatoes, but they also grew soybeans to fill in the rotation. This was an early innovation with granular weed control. That was one of the first machines we saw in the county where these granules were sprinkled over top of the row after the corn or soybeans was planted. And this was fairly effective, but it didn't last too long because we had better methods that came along. But here again, that's a four-row planter, and that was a big step up from the two-row planter. Here's what happens with that effective weed control. On the right is a jungle of foxtail, which was a serious problem, especially on the east side on the black soils. But when we had some very good chemical weed control, the plot on the left showed where a chemical weed control was applied, and you can see the difference in your results. Now, this was a thrash machine, and that happened to be on my home farm up in Garrett County. There were a few thrash machines in Wicomico in the 40s and 50s, but Wicomico, we did not have a lot of small grain like barley or wheat or oats, so there weren't many thrash machines. But in Garrett County, where you had a lot of dairy and livestock, there were a lot of thrash machines to do the thrashing.
Now, just for us laymen, us non-farmers, describe the process from the field to the grain actually going to the mill.
Well, it was a very intensive operation. First of all, the grain had to be cut with a binder, They cut the grain, bound it, and then it had to be shocked in the field to dry. And then after the grain was dried, it would be hauled to the barn or the thrash machine outside and thrashed. And most of this grain was fed to livestock, either dairy, beef, or hogs. You might recognize the chap there on the tractor.
Would that be Tommy Miller?
That would be Tommy Miller, that's right.
Your son. The pride of Rockawalking, Tommy Miller.
Now, soybeans have always been an important crop in Wicomico County, and this just happens to be an excellent field, and that is Wallace Luffman and John Hockmuth there in looking at the soybeans and checking them out, and they're certainly ready for harvest.
Mm-hmm. Pretty field.
That was an excellent, no weed, very, very wonderful weed control, and a good yield of soybeans. Of course, combines came along. The early combines did not have a cab, and a lot of times soybeans were harvested in cold weather, in maybe November, late November, early December, and it would be sometimes very cold out there, but the farmers had to bundle up, and when it was cold and you had a northwest wind, that was the time to harvest soybeans. That was Albert Reddish, who farmed on the Naylor Mill Road.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a 2-row corn picker, which was a corn sheller. And here again, it had a small tank, but it was a big improvement over the 1-row picker, which was mostly for ear corn. And I don't recall who that farmer was. That was quite some time ago. This is Paul Mitchell. And this was one of the years when we had a real drought. And that's why the soybeans are so spindly looking. And you see they got very little height. And of course, resulting in not a good yield.
But is that snow on the ground?
That's dust. That's sandy.
Oh, I see.
It's sandy soil, and consequently, the drought hurt them very badly. There's was one of our good young farmers. He's now a little bit older, but that is Ben Brittingham, standing in one of his champion fields of field corn. Ben had excellent soil on his farms, and it was that nice black deep soil, and it would just grow good corn even in a dry year.
Ben's down near Powellville.
Ben lives on a farm near Powellville, right. That's Lester Richardson showing off some of his champion ear corn.
Look at that, Lester Fowler Richardson.
Ear corn was, for years it was all picked one year and then either sold or cribbed to dry, and then sold to the feed mills.
And then run through some sort of hand or automated sheller?
Oh, yeah, the shellers were automatic, yeah. That's another, this is one of the first, I think that's a 4-row corn picker. That was a big innovation over the 2-row. Well, we started out with a 1-row corn picker, and then went to 2-row, and then this is a 4-row picker, so
that's pretty much like we see today.
Today they're even 8-row, and out in the Midwest they're bigger. This is that is Bill Guy.
That's your neighbor.
My neighbor, and this is his 6-row corn picker, and that machine can do a lot of acres in a day. Now, the ladies there are working with the nutrient management program, and I think Bill had a nutrient management plan. They're probably going over it with him and making sure that everything's okay.
He looks pretty pleased with what they're saying. I don't know what they're saying.
Well, I think Bill was, they probably were proud of Bill, what he's doing, and that worked out very nicely. This was a big innovation for setting out tomato plants, peppers, strawberries, and other transplanted crops, which before the transplanter, this is a one-row transplanter, before the transplanter came along, they had to be set by hand, and that was a very tedious job. On this machine, 2 people would sit behind the tractor and place the plants in the wheel, and as the wheel turned, it would put them in the ground, and it just speeded up the operation tremendously.
Is it water in the drum in the front?
Yeah, I meant to mention the drum.
It would drop a little bit of water in each plant?
There was a trickle of water on each row. Now, back in the 40s and 50s, canning tomatoes were a big crop in Wicomico County. Now, this young chap wasn't very happy, I'm sure, picking tomatoes, because it was a hot, hard job for young boys. And if my memory serves me right, that's Bryce Turner picking tomatoes in the field. That probably was his 4-H project.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you probably recognize that man, Phil. That's
Mr. Guy.
Irving Guy. Irving was, I think, one of the champion tomato growers in the county. I mean, he grew beautiful tomatoes, as you can see, and these were open field tomatoes. No plastic, no stake, just open field for canning. They were canning tomatoes, and it was
Now, where were the canning factories?
all over the county.
Almost
Chesterville, Bivalve, Nanticoke, Salisbury, Hebron. They were all over the county. There were even 1 or 2 on the east side.
Oh, my land.
There's a nice field of tomatoes. They will be hauled to the factory, either in Salisbury or Quantico or Bivalve, wherever, even maybe up to Cambridge. They had a number of them in Cambridge. Then after those were all hand-picked. After the hand-picking dropped off, we had mechanical harvesters, such as you see here. These were for processing tomatoes, and that speeded up the task of harvesting, but those machines were extremely expensive, and it still took labor to separate the trash from the tomatoes.
Now, the tomatoes there were for tomato sauce, tomato juice, that sort of thing.
Right, they were all for canning. Now we're still growing tomatoes, but they're all staked on plastic, and the tomatoes they grow today are all fresh market, and they're a beautiful product. They really are. This is a Wicomico County field that belonged to Donald Hales.
Oh, my land of mercy.
Field pumpkins are still being grown in the county. There's a big demand for field pumpkins in the fall. And this is Ralph Harcum, and Ralph told me that pumpkin weighed 150 pounds. Of course, Ralph was a young man then, Phil. And that's his Uncle Edward by the tractor.
Edward Holloway.
Edward Holloway and Herman Malco. And I don't remember the gentleman behind the tractor. Plastic came into being in the early 70s, and this is, I think that's Phil Bennett with cantaloupes on plastic, and that was a big innovation in the plastic in the cantaloupe and cucumber production and watermelons. This is a field before they start to set fruit. A good field of cantaloupes that should produce a huge crop.
Why is the grain growing ever so often?
Those are windbreaks to keep the wind from damaging the plants, especially after they set young fruit, and it worked very well. Here's a shot of some of the watermelons that went to Laurel. We had an oxer block in Salisbury for years, and it has since, that site has since been sold probably to go into housing. Sweet potatoes were a major crop in Wicomico in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And this is just a typical field showing the boxes as they were picked up ready to go into the packing shed. And today, This is Howard Humphreys. Howard was an excellent sweet potato grower, but today I don't know one single commercial sweet potato grower left. We have a few farmers that grow a small acreage just for retail market.
Now, what was the growing season for sweet potatoes?
Well,
they planted them.
They would plant the beds in March and pull the plants in May or early June, and then in usually October they would start harvesting.
Mm-hmm. And they had to put them in barns or
they went in a storage
houses to dry them out.
Right, to dry and cure them. They grew in a sweet potato storage house. And this is an example of, this was 5 Star Farms located out near Hebron. And
which then later became the Mautek.
Mautek, yeah.
Yeah.
This facility would handle about 150,000 bushels of sweet potatoes.
Wow.
And then would be packed out during the winter to be shipped to northern or western markets. When moldboard plows were being used, before no tillage came along, plow demonstrations were a very popular event here in the county. And this is just one example where we would have a demonstration of plowing to make sure the plows were adjusted correctly, because that would save fuel and also would do a better job of plowing if it was properly adjusted.
Is that is plowing a field almost a thing of the past now?
Moldboard plowing is very, very seldom used anymore.
They use no-till.
No-till has come into being, and no-till has been a great revolution for our sandy soils.
Mm-hmm.
Field demonstrations were also very popular in the 60s and 70s. This is a field meeting to demonstrate weed control, or could be a fertility demonstration, could be a variety demonstration. But they were very popular during that period.
Now, who's that with the light jacket talking there on the left with dark hair?
That happened to be me. Notice I had black hair then.
I noticed.
Hog production was a very important enterprise in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and this is just one example of one of the farms where they did what we call hogging down corn. They let the hogs harvest the corn, and then when they became near market age or market weight, they would simply load them up and take them to the processing plant. This was a range type method of growing hogs, where the mother hogs would be turned out in the pasture, and believe it or not, they would find a shelter, and that's where they would have their pigs. They would keep them out of the rain, and during the hot weather, it provided shade too. A number of farmers built confinement houses like this, and that was a new innovation in hog production. However, most of those houses today are empty or being used for something else. Some were converted to chicken houses, and some were just simply converted to storage. But today we have practically no production of hogs in the county. The hog production moved to North Carolina or the Midwest, and we lost our markets, and that was the end of a lot of hog production. The Purdue Company, of course, is a tremendous company, and it has made a lot of farmers in Wicomico. It has put them on the board as far as growing poultry, and it's a good market for corn and soybeans. So I think we were blessed to have the Purdue Company in Wicomico County. It's now one of the leading poultry companies in the entire country. Some of the farmers, back in the early 50s and 60s, the chicken houses had to be cleaned by hand. That means they had to shovel the manure onto the manure spreaders. This farmer wasn't satisfied with the shovel, so he made his own. That's Bill Bradley, but I think that was to spread sawdust or shavings rather than chicken manure. Triple-deck chicken houses came into being. That chicken house there would probably hold maybe 45 or 50,000 broilers. The concept was to save land and also you had one roof. However, they were more labor intensive, so the concept did not last that long. And now, I don't know of any triple deck chicken house that's still in business. Most of them were either torn down or converted to storage. This is the more modern type chicken farm on the farm of Hank and Henry Oakley. And it has self-feeders, self-water, so that really was great improvements in growing broilers. This is one of the old three-story chicken houses. It's now not in use. It's turned into a storage facility. And you might recognize that chap. That's Mr. Bryce Turner from Hebron.
His arms are still long like they were when he was a kid.
Yes, still long and thin. One concept that took place in the late 70s and 80s was a lot of farmland growing houses. This was one of the first developments outside the city limits of Salisbury. Not the first, but one of the first, Rock Walking Village.
Well, that was Bryce Turner's father's farm.
That was
converted,
Bryce's
right?
father's farm. Another premium development was Nistdale, and this happens to be West Nistdale, and that was started by Otis Esham, who had been in the poultry business for many years.
Now, Bob, the farmland that was converted into residential developments, was that prime farmland or was it the poor farmland?
That was some of our best farmland. Normally, the best farmland also makes the best development land. Strawberries in the 40s and 50s were a very, very good crop, a major crop for a lot of farmers, especially on the east side of Wicomico County. The gentleman in the center there is Cloyd Twilley, who was a very good strawberry grower, and they're just showing some of his berries that they were picking that day. Gorman Brittingham, you might recognize Gorman. He grew strawberries. He still grows strawberries, but now I think most of his berries are for direct sale or pick your own, and that's one of Gorman's daughters there with him, showing a quart of beautiful berries. Now that wasn't that was a long time ago,
Yeah,
Phil,
but
when that picture was taken.
it still makes your mouth water just
Yes,
looking
it
at
does.
it.
Dairy farming, when I came to the county, we had 15 dairy farms, and this was one of the last farms to stay in the dairy business. That was Luther Houston and his grandson Gino Lowe, and that was Rosewood Farms, and they had one of the most outstanding Guernsey herds in the entire state. But a number of years ago, Luther decided to sell the dairy herd, and they converted to beef cattle, and of course they grow a lot of field crops now.
Gino has a lot of alfalfa.
And alfalfa, that's one of their major crops now.
But he still has some cattle.
Beef
they're
cattle.
beef cows. Okay.
The Harcum Farms up near Mardella is the last commercial dairy herd in Wicomico County. The very last one. Now we need more cows like this, I think, to have more dairy. We're not getting much rain, but Phil, we have had rain sometimes in our county.
Is that a flooded field?
That was in 1958, and that, believe it or not, was taken along Nanticoke Road.
Oh, my land.
They're in the corner of Nanticoke and Levendershiel Road. I mentioned before, the east side of the county has low black soil, and it does need drainage. And once the drainage systems come in, it opened up that area in a marvelous way to grow crops that, well, we just were unheard of before. This happens to be an outlet ditch for the Idlet Tax Ditch.
Well, explain a tax ditch association. How does that work? How is it organized?
Well, the tax ditches are, that was actually passed by the Maryland legislature, where when the tax ditch organizes, they have to have managers, and they can levy assessments on farmland that would drain into a tax ditch. And then they have the tax office, they collect the taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So once you're in the tax ditch, the tax assessments become mandatory, and that was the only way a lot of these ditches were built, was from the Maryland drainage law that was passed in, I think, 1946.
But a typical tax ditch might have 10 or 15 farms that it drains.
This was the Idle tax ditch. It had 272 farms drained in to the Idle tax ditch.
To eventually go into the Wicomico River.
Into the Wicomico River, yes.
Uh-huh.
Now we're into the
Wow.
large farm equipment out there. That's Donald Hales. And of course, Donald uses that type of equipment to prepare his vegetable land. Most of our corn and soybean land is no-till now, so we have no need for that kind of equipment. But on vegetable production, that equipment is still necessary to work the land and prepare it for either plastic production or whatever they want to do. This is a Geno Low filling up a modern
Planter.
grain drill, either to plant barley, wheat, or rye. Sod production, we had several sod farms in the 70s, but here in the last 5 to 10 years, sod production has become quite a new enterprise. A number of farms are now growing sod instead of corn or soybeans or vegetable crops. Sod is, this is a sod harvesting machine. It doesn't require a lot of labor now to harvest a crop. This machine will slice, cut, and stack the sod ready for shipment to a nearby housing development or across the bay up to another development.
So now, how long does the sod, from the time they plant the seed until they harvest it, is that one season?
Well, about 18 months normally.
And then they have to keep that cut and watered during the
Oh yes,
summer.
it requires a lot of watering and a lot of cutting.
So it's not a cheap crop to raise.
It's expensive to grow. Center pivot irrigation, when it came into being, it opened up a lot of land either for sod production, and of course a lot of farmers now irrigate corn and soybeans with a center pivot system, which are, they're not labor intensive like the old hand pipes that they had to move by hand. These systems, they move themselves, so you can irrigate anywhere from, 30 up to 150 acres on a single circle.
But it's not cheap.
It's not cheap, no.
And I guess the key is that the difference between irrigated and non-irrigated land is that you have to take the expense of irrigation and compare that to the bottom line to really see whether it pays or doesn't pay. But it must pay as dry as it is in some of these summers.
Yes. Well, last summer, the difference between irrigated and non-irrigated could have been maybe from 70 bushels of non-irrigated up to 200 irrigated.
Oh, wow.
So it's a good insurance policy.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, we've had a number of new farm markets on Route 50, and this is one of the new farm markets, Guy Farms.
Bobby Guy.
Now
that's just, I guess the key is to have an area that's on a well-traveled road.
Route 50, people going to Ocean City, that's a wonderful location. Royer Farms, the Royer Farms is not there anymore, but the market is still in operation.
Out near Mardella.
That was at Mardella, and they had, in the fall, they had tremendous displays of mums like this, and that's a big attraction for people that want to beautify their homes. This is Phil Williams. He has a market on Nanticoke Road, and he's replenished his market from the pickup.
Well, he also supplements his market with Christmas trees
and flowers, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So he's open from April till December.
Till December, yes. a lot of farmland, I mentioned before, went into housing developments, but for the first time we've had a number of churches built outside the metropolitan area into farmland. This is one of the big churches on Nanticoke Road, a beautiful church with a large congregation.
Church of the Nazarene, yeah.
Here's a typical farmstead showing the flag.
That looks a little bit like Rockawalking Road. I mean, Levin to Shield Road.
That is Levin to Shield Road.
That's your farm.
Yes. Now, we haven't seen much snow, but here's an example of what it looks like when we do have snow. That was taken a few years ago. Here again off Levin to Shield Road. This was the blizzard of 1987, Phil, when we, I think maybe 15 or 16 inches of snow that time.
Mm-hmm.
But it was quite a snowstorm.
Is snow a good thing for crops?
Snow is a good thing. It builds up the soil moisture and protects winter crops.
Oh my land, there's a couple of Miller kids.
I was going home one day and I saw these two kids running around after a rain, and I just couldn't help but take a shot of it.
Uh-huh. And that's Tommy. Tommy and his sister Pam.
That's right, yeah. Don't tell Tommy.
I won't tell him.
Things haven't changed. We still have flocks of geese that migrate down from the Hudson Bay area to spend the winter in Salisbury and Wicomico County. But unfortunately, more and more are staying over and become resident geese, and they do pose a problem for a lot of farmers.
Yeah. So after the time that you served, you retired as Ag Extension Agent, and then you went to work for Maryland National Bank. But what did you do there, Bob?
Well, I was the ag lender for our agricultural part of the bank.
So if a farmer on the Lower Eastern Shore wanted to, build 2 or 3 chicken houses and wanted a loan for that, you would be the one that
right.
Maryland National would assign to
help farmers with operating loans. A lot of farmers would borrow money to buy fertilizer, seed, and other commodities, or for equipment. We did equipment loans, we did operating loans, and we also did loans to buy land.
Farmers, I've heard that farmers are good environmentalists. What do you think? How do you agree with that statement?
I think most of them are, yes.
Well, Lewis Riley was on PAC 14 talking one time about the voluntary nutrient management program in the state of Maryland, and he thought that he made the statement that farmers are probably the best environmentalists of anybody because they treat the land like it needs to be treated, because the land is their major equity, and I guess that's the point he was making.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. A lot of farmers, they're not going to use more fertilizer or more chemicals than they need, because first of all, it's expensive, and secondly, it doesn't do. You can do harm if you over fertilize or apply more chemicals than necessary. You can do more damage than good.
Uh-huh.
And to put on more fertilizer than you need might be throwing money away.
Bob, in the early part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, I guess some of those tomatoes and watermelons and that sort of thing were shipped to Baltimore by boat, were they not?
Yes.
And of course that's before the 1954 opening of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. I guess that had an effect as well.
A lot of watermelons were shipped to Baltimore by boat, and also rail. At one time, they would load boxcars of strawberries from Princess Anne and Pittsville to go up to Baltimore, New York.
Is that right?
With they said refrigerated boxcars, but of course they had ice was the refrigeration.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how strawberries would leave the shore.
And so they could get up to where the market was,
where the
people were.
And they had to get there pretty fast.
Yeah, yeah. Well, When you came here in 1953, what would you guess the average price per acre of an acre of farmland was worth? And maybe
Well,
what is it worth today?
There was some land being bought in the 50s for $125, $150 an acre.
Hard to imagine. Today,
Well, today it's based on how many building lots will accommodate.
the value of the land is not
Not for
farmland.
farming,
the value
no.
of the land is based on developmental,
Yeah, and
the ability to develop that
where
property.
it would develop, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and because the tax ditches drain the east side of the county, the east side of the county also became
The land
susceptible
became,
to
land became
development.
a lot more valuable, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, some of it would be developable, but a lot of it would still have, you'd have a water problem with septic.
When you were the county agent, were there times of the year when comparisons were made, let's say between the sandy soils on the west side of the county and those farmers, and the farmers on the east side of the county, and they would compare yields and that sort of thing? And was it kind of a friendly competition?
Well, it was known fact then that the best corn yields were normally on the east side, and I know there for a couple of years we had a 4-H corn club, and the 4-H club members on the east side would always have better yields because they had the black land,
Yeah.
which had more water retention.
Well, and is it true that sometimes any land or land that was closer to the Wicomico River seemed to get more rain during the summertime than other parts of the county?
Well, I'd always heard that. Of course, I had no way to determine if that was a fact or not, but sometimes some of the soils along the Wicomico are a little bit heavier soils. In other words, have a little more clay and loam content, and that makes a big difference in whether or not the soil can hold moisture.
Oh, I see.
On the west side of the county, a lot of our soils are very sandy, and the ability to retain moisture is very limited because of the amount of sand.
Now, the sandy soil is what also was good for the sweet potatoes,
Absolutely, had to.
because it made it easier to dig them. And
Well, they just grew better, the better shape, and of course, sandy soils are also very necessary for cantaloupes, and watermelons, and cucumbers to grow fast. The root structure would grow much faster in sandy soil than it will on heavy clay soil.
well, let's talk for a minute about sweet potatoes and your assessment of what happens when sweet potatoes were such a big crop. And you showed the slide of the 5-star operation out there, the number of bushels that they handled, and then all of a sudden, it seemed like all of a sudden, or over a period of 3 or 4 years, some other area of the country becomes the sweet potato king, so to speak. What happens that moves a crop from one area to another?
Well, North Carolina became very heavily involved in sweet potato production. North Carolina and Louisiana were two of the main sweet potato areas at that time, and they simply could produce an acre of sweet potatoes cheaper than we could.
Oh, I see.
And they started to flood the markets, and when the prices got down so low that our farmers weren't making any money, then they
quit
growing.
raising
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
And a lot of farms got older, and they had no one to replace them. None of their family members were interested in taking up the slack, so they just started to grow other crops.
I've heard statistics that in today's time, less than 2% of the population are actually involved on site with farming. Was that the case when you came here in the 50s, or was it
Oh,
a
no.
bigger percentage?
Oh yeah, it was a much bigger percentage then. I think right now it's about 1.7 people on the farm of our total population.
And the average farmer in 1953 had a certain number of acres, I guess an average size farm that could produce an income for a man and his family. And how does that compare to the average number of acres that a farmer tills today?
Well, when I came to Wicomico, I'd say the farm size would vary. I'm talking about acres tilled, would vary maybe from 30 up to 200. And at that time, a 200-acre farm or more was
big.
Was rather big, yeah. Well, today we have farms that are tilling 2,000 to 3,000 acres with equipment and mechanized,
mm-hmm.
and that's the big change.
And a man that's tilling 1,500 or 2,000 acres, how many people does it take to do that?
He may only have one. He may only have one other man, if he's in the grain. If he's in grain production.
Like a father and son.
Yeah.
Could very easily do that.
If he has vegetables, then takes a lot more labor.
Yeah, yeah. Bob, we want to thank you for giving us this glimpse of how agriculture has changed in Wicomico County over the course of your lifetime, and I know you've devoted a lifetime to it. You still live on a farm, and you still raise some nice, I know you raise some nice peaches, because I've had some of them.
If we don't have a frost, yes. I might just show these. I think these blossoms are, thing is summertime, and it's really not.
And today is the middle of March.
And we can have frost up until the middle of April.
And if frost comes on the buds, then then you get no peaches.
If it's a hard frost, it would certainly kill those that are open. But if it gets down to about 26 or 27, it could damage most of these.
And that's your cash crop now.
Well, yeah.
I don't know what you do without it.
That's my coffee crop.
You and Pat would have to go on welfare.
Yeah, we probably would.
All right. Well, we want to thank you, Bob, for taking this time to talk with us, and it's been very, very interesting.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for being with us here on Digitizing Delmarva Heritage and Tradition.